"Get out of my sight, you worthless piece of trash!" my mother screamed, her face contorted with the same venomous rage I'd grown used to over the years. The crystal wine glass in her hand shook as she leveled it at me like a weapon. "You think you can just walk in here and humiliate me in front of the Harrisons? You're nothing but a disappointment." I stood there in the marble foyer of our Charlotte mansion, my designer dress ripped at the shoulder where she had grabbed me moments ago. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was, being called worthless, in a house that technically belonged to me, by a woman who had no idea her lavish life dangled from a thread I controlled. My name is Julia Bennett, and I'm 27 years old. For some, that might seem young to be in charge of a $100 million family trust. But my grandfather had always recognized something in me that my mother, Elaine, refused to see. Tonight's eruption started over something trivial. I'd corrected her when she told the Harrisons that our family built Bennett Industries from scratch. The truth was, we'd inherited it, but my mother never let facts spoil her grand stories. "I've spent my entire life building this family's reputation," she continued, her voice echoing off the imported Italian marble. "And you ruined it in 5 minutes with that smart mouth of yours." Behind her, my stepfather Victor nodded along, the perfect spineless yes-man he'd always been. He had married into our wealth 3 years ago and had since become Mother's ideal accomplice in maintaining the illusion that they were self-made moguls. Their matching Rolexes gleamed under the chandelier, both bought with money from the trust I managed. What they didn't know was that tonight's dinner hadn't been the disaster Mother imagined. In fact, it had unfolded exactly as I intended. Dr. Harrison wasn't just a family friend. He was the trustee waiting for the right opportunity to enforce the provisions my grandfather had put in place, ones that would trigger if my mother ever crossed certain lines. "You know what your problem is, Julia?" Mother stepped closer, the sharp scent of expensive French perfume failing to mask the undertone of her third bottle of wine. "You think you're better than everyone else, but you're just a spoiled little girl who's never worked for anything." I almost laughed at the irony. Instead, I smiled, and that only made her angrier. The storm gathering in her eyes told me everything I needed to know. Tonight would be the night that changed everything. Growing up, a Bennett meant living with secrets wrapped in silk and buried under money. My grandfather, Charles Bennett, had built our fortune through sharp investments and meticulous planning. But more importantly, he'd seen through my mother's facade long before I did. I remembered being 16, standing in his leather-lined study, when he explained the trust structure he'd created. "Julia," he had said quietly, folding his weathered hands over mine, "your mother is beautiful, but she doesn't have the judgment to preserve what our family has built. That's why when you turn 25, the trust will be yours. Until then, keep this between us." I'd promised him I would. For 2 years, after taking control, I let Mother believe she held the purse strings, throwing her lavish parties, buying her sports cars, redecorating the house every season, while she spent what she thought was hers. It worked, until Victor came along. Where Mother was vain and materialistic, Victor was cunning and greedy. He encouraged her worst habits, pushed her to spend more, flaunt more, dominate more, especially over me. He whispered poison into her ear about how I was undermining her authority, how I needed to be put in my place. What he didn't realize was that I was documenting every word. And Dr. Harrison, my grandfather's oldest friend and backup trustee, had been visiting more often, ostensibly for dinner, but in truth, to collect evidence of Mother's instability and Victor's financial manipulation. Tonight had been the final test. I'd baited Mother into embellishing the family history in front of witnesses, knowing Dr. Harrison would be watching. "You know what, Julia? I've had enough of your attitude," Mother hissed now, her voice dropping into the dangerous register that always preceded her worst attacks. "Maybe it's time you learned some respect." Victor shifted, blocking my path to the door. Their plan was obvious: corner me, intimidate me into submission. "Elaine, maybe we should all calm down," Dr. Harrison said from behind me, stepping out from the dining room with his medical bag in hand. "This is a family matter," Victor cut in smoothly. But Dr. Harrison didn't leave. He stayed by the archway, close enough to witness everything, just far enough not to be physically involved. "You think you're so clever," Mother spat, eyes locked on me. "Always correcting me, always acting superior. I brought you into this world, and I can take you out of it." The thread hung between us like a toxin. "Mother, you're drunk," I said evenly. "Go to bed. We can talk tomorrow." "Don't you dare dismiss me!" she shouted, loud enough for lingering guests to hear. "I own this house. I control everything in your pathetic life." I laughed, not cruelly, but with genuine amusement, and watched something snap in her expression. "You think this is funny?" she whispered, moving toward me with Victor tensing behind her. The chandelier threw jagged shadows across the marble. For the first time in years, I felt genuine fear. "Let me show you how funny this is," she snarled, then lunged. Her manicured hands slammed into my shoulders. I stumbled back, my heels snagging on the Persian rug, falling hard toward the closed glass doors. The impact shattered them in a spray of glittering shards. The glass tore through my dress, my arms, my face. I landed on the stone terrace outside, the world silent but for the soft tinkling of settling fragments. Then came the pain-searing, bright, immediate. Blood pooled beneath me. "Oh my God," I heard Dr. Harrison's voice. "She fell," Victor said smoothly. "She was drunk. She fell through the door. Everyone saw it." I forced myself up, glass embedding deeper into my palms, and looked back at Mother. Her hand over her mouth, eyes wide with either shock or satisfaction. I couldn't tell which. Dr. Harrison was beside me now, working quickly. Mother, meanwhile, was already spinning her story inside, telling guests I'd had too much to drink. "Ambulance?" Dr. Harrison whispered. "No," I said. "Just patch me up." He didn't argue. As he worked in the guest bathroom, I caught sight of my reflection-bloody dress, glass in my hair, cuts tracing my arms like maps. "Julia," he said quietly, "what really happened?" "You saw it?" I answered. "She shoved me." He nodded. "Yes, and it's all recorded." That's when I noticed the small recording device on the counter, my grandfather's old safeguard. Every word, every threat, the assault, it was all there. They had been plotting to have me declared incompetent and seize the trust. But tonight, they'd given me everything I needed to destroy them. By the time the backup trustees arrived, lawyers moving through the house like precision tools, the game was over. The police followed, documenting the assault. By 3 a.m., Victor was in handcuffs for embezzlement. Mother was served a restraining order and faced a competency hearing. She called it a misunderstanding as she packed her designer luggage. I stood in her doorway, bloodied dress still clinging to me. "Where will you go?" I asked. "Hotel, I suppose, until this is sorted out." "Family," I echoed coldly. By dawn, the house was silent, and for the first time, it felt like mine. 6 months later, sitting in my grandfather's study with trust reports in front of me, the scars on my arms barely visible, I understood something. The most powerful revenge isn't about destroying your enemies. It's about showing the world exactly who they are. Mother's empire had always been a mirage. In the end, her own cruelty was the blade that cut it down. In the months that followed, The fallout from that night unraveled Elaine and Victor's lives with the precision of a carefully wound clock finally breaking apart. Victor's gambling debts caught up to him quickly in jail. It turned out that the underground world of creditors was far less forgiving when the money he'd lost belonged to someone else's family fortune. Inside, he found no allies, only the cold reality that there was no trust fund to bail him out anymore. Mother, meanwhile, was forced into a life she had never imagined for herself. She rented a modest apartment in a less than fashionable part of town, trading marble floors and crystal chandeliers for beige carpeting and buzzing fluorescent lights. For the first time in 30 years, she had to work a receptionist at a small medical office, where no one cared about her designer wardrobe or the last name she'd once worn like a crown. The competency hearing had been swift and decisive. The evidence was undeniable financial mismanagement, erratic behavior, documented threats, and the recorded assault. The ruling stripped her of any claim to the family trust, and the restraining order meant she could never set foot on the property again. Her carefully curated social circle disintegrated almost overnight. Friends stopped calling, invitations disappeared, and the people who had once clung to her at charity galas now crossed the street to avoid her. Without the illusion of wealth, she was simply Elaine, the woman who had fallen from grace. For me, life took on a new clarity. I devoted myself to restoring the family's reputation, not the manufactured one Mother had flaunted, but the quiet, steady respect my grandfather had valued. The trust's assets grew under my management, investments made with precision and care. I funded scholarships in my grandfather's name, supported local charities without fanfare, and rebuilt Bennett Industries' standing in the business community. Sometimes I would pass by the guest bathroom, where Dr. Harrison had bandaged me that night, and I'd pause, remembering the metallic scent of blood and the calm determination in his voice. Without him, and without my grandfather's foresight, things might have gone very differently. 6 months to the day after everything changed, I sat in my grandfather's study, the warm scent of leather and old books surrounding me. The quarterly trust reports lay open on the desk. The house was quiet in a way it had never been before, not the brittle, tense quiet of suppressed anger, but the peaceful silence of a place finally free from chaos. The scars on my arms had faded to fine pale lines, visible only if you knew where to look. They didn't bother me. They were proof. Proof of survival, of strategy, of victory. I'd learned something vital. Sometimes revenge isn't loud or messy. Sometimes it's as simple as pulling back the curtain and letting the truth do the work. Elaine had believed she ruled an empire, but it had never been hers. Not the house, not the company, not even the respect she thought she commanded. It had all been built on an illusion, and when the illusion shattered, just like that glass door, it was gone forever. On rare occasions, I'd catch whispers about Elaine and Victor's downfall drifting through certain circles, always spoken in hushed, almost gleeful tones. People loved a scandal, but they loved the moral of it even more. And ours had a simple one. Arrogance without substance always collapses. Victor's name began circulating in legal bulletins, tied to not just embezzlement, but also a string of fraud investigations that predated his marriage to my mother. Apparently, he'd been running the same game on other wealthy women before her, though none of them had been able to prove anything. My case, however, had given the authorities exactly what they needed to unravel the rest. The last I heard, he'd taken a plea deal in exchange for a reduced sentence, though reduced still meant years behind bars. Elaine didn't visit him in prison. I suspect part of her blamed him for her own fall, but the truth was, they had destroyed each other equally. Without him, she might have coasted for years on careful manipulation and charm. With him, the spiral had been faster and far more public. I didn't reach out to her either. I'd made a decision that night on the terrace when blood pooled beneath me and glass sparkled like ice around my body, that she would never again have the power to touch my life. The restraining order kept her physically distant, but it was my own resolve that kept her emotionally irrelevant. Dr. Harrison continued to visit, though now it was for quiet dinners and business updates rather than covert evidence gathering. He'd been my grandfather's friend, but over the months he'd become something more, a mentor, an anchor, someone who reminded me that strength didn't always have to roar. Sometimes it was enough to stand still while the storm raged around you, letting it pass. Bennett Industries began to shift as well. Without Mother's constant interference, I could run the company according to the principles my grandfather had believed in. Integrity, long-term vision, and a commitment to the people who had helped build it. We cut ties with vanity projects, restructured failing divisions, and reinvested in the ones that mattered. There were nights when I'd walk through the marble foyer where it had all begun, the confrontation, the shove, the crash. The glass doors had been replaced long ago, but I could still almost hear the sharp crack of impact, feel the sting of betrayal sharper than any shard that had pierced my skin. And yet, I didn't regret a second of it. Because without that night, the truth might have stayed buried under silk and lies for years longer. Without that night, I might still be playing the quiet, dutiful daughter while they plotted ways to strip me of everything. Instead, I stood here now scarred, but stronger. And the empire? It was finally in the hands of someone who understood exactly what it took to protect it. I knew one day Elaine might try to circle back, to play the part of the remorseful mother seeking reconciliation, and maybe I'd let her speak her piece. But I would never forget the moment she'd chosen to push her own daughter through a glass door rather than face the truth. Some betrayals are survivable, some are not. And in the Bennett family, we always kept records. About a year after that night, I received an envelope with no return address. Inside was a single sheet of stationery, thick, expensive, the kind my mother used to favor. The handwriting was hers, though shakier than I remembered. Julia, I don't expect forgiveness. I just want you to know that I think about that night every day. I know I crossed a line I can never uncross. I hope you're well. No apology. No acknowledgement of the years that led up to it. Just a vague nod to the fact that her actions had destroyed what little bond we had left. I read it once, then slid it into a folder labeled legal and filed it away. Not out of sentiment, but because in my world, every piece of correspondence was a potential record. I didn't write back. Life without her was quieter, cleaner. The house no longer echoed with her clipped orders to staff or Victor's low, manipulative murmurs. Instead, I filled it with people who contributed something: real trusted employees, old family friends, even a few new acquaintances who didn't care about my last name. Dr. Harrison, ever the strategist, occasionally reminded me to keep my guard up. Elaine may be down, he'd say, but people like her have a way of trying to reclaim ground, even if it's scorched. He wasn't wrong. Through careful channels, I learned she'd been making small inquiries about trust law, about possible appeals, about whether her daughter might soften over time. But every attempt fizzled quickly. The legal wall my grandfather had built and I had fortified was impenetrable. Victor's fate was less ambiguous. His plea deal had landed him in a medium security facility, but a few months in, he was transferred after a violent altercation. The details never made it into official reports, but the subtext was clear enough. Debts unpaid in the world he'd once manipulated with ease were now being collected in far harsher currency. I rarely thought about him unless prompted. He'd been a catalyst, yes, but in the end, just another opportunist who underestimated me. Bennett Industries continued to thrive. We expanded into new markets, launched initiatives my grandfather would have been proud of, and restored our name in the business community. At quarterly meetings, I'd sometimes catch the older board members watching me with quiet approval, as though they'd been waiting years for this version of leadership. One crisp autumn afternoon, I stood on the terrace where I'd landed after crashing through the glass door. The new panes reflected the late-day sun, and the stone beneath my feet was spotless. You'd never know what had happened there, but I knew, and I'd never forget, because that was the night the illusion shattered hers, Victor's, maybe even a little of my own. And from the pieces, I'd built something real. I didn't just survive my mother's cruelty, I turned it into the foundation of my strength. 2 years to the day after it all happened, I found myself back in my grandfather's study on a quiet winter evening. The fire crackled softly, casting long shadows over the rows of leather-bound books. Outside, snow drifted down over the gardens, covering the world in silence. I had just finished signing off on another set of trust reports when Dr. Harrison arrived, as he often did on this anniversary. He carried with him a bottle of my grandfather's favorite scotch and 2 glasses. "To Charles," he said, pouring for both of us, and to his granddaughter, who proved him right. We clinked glasses, the sound sharp in the stillness. I took a slow sip, letting the warmth spread through me. "I've been thinking," I said, setting my glass down, "about the difference between protecting something and controlling it. Mother thought they were the same thing, Victor too. But grandfather, he knew better." Dr. Harrison nodded. "Control is about keeping others down. Protection is about lifting something up, even if you have to step aside for it to grow." I thought about how much had changed since that night, about the way the staff now worked without fear of Mother's sudden tempers, about the letters I'd received from scholarship students whose education was now funded through the trust, about the quiet, steady increase in the company's value, not because of flash or theatrics, but because we made decisions rooted in sense, not ego. There were still whispers about Elaine from time to time. A few people in town claimed to have seen her at small social gatherings, dressed well enough to pass for her old self if you didn't look too closely. But those who knew her story could see it, something missing in her eyes, a hollowness that no designer dress could disguise. Victor, on the other hand, had all but vanished from conversation. He was still serving his time, with no clear path back into society's good graces. For a man who thrived on manipulation, anonymity might have been the harshest punishment of all. I had no interest in revenge beyond what was already done. The trust was secure. The business was stable, and the people who had tried to take it from me had been removed, not just from the house, but from my life entirely. As the firelight flickered across the walls, I realized that what I felt now wasn't triumph. It was closure. My grandfather had once told me, "The true test of power isn't how much you can take from someone. It's how much you can afford to give away without fear of losing yourself." For the first time, I understood exactly what he meant, and I intended to live by it. That night, after Dr. Harrison left, I lingered in the study a little longer. The snow outside had stopped, leaving the gardens pristine and untouched. The fire was burning low, its glow warm against the quiet stillness of the house. I looked around the room, the shelves lined with my grandfather's books, the desk where so many decisions had been made, the framed photographs of a family that, at least in part, had only existed in appearances. This house had seen betrayal, manipulation, and greed. But it had also seen loyalty, foresight, and strength. And now it stood as something entirely new, mine. I closed the last ledger, locked it away in the desk, and turned out the lights. As I walked through the silent halls toward my bedroom, my footsteps echoed softly on the marble floors. No voices followed me. No threats lurked around the corners. No one waited to take what wasn't theirs. For the first time in my life, the house and everything in it wasn't a battlefield. It was home, and I intended to keep it that way. 6 months later, spring sunlight streamed through the tall windows of the study, falling across stacks of reports and freshly signed agreements. Bennett Industries had just completed its most profitable quarter in over a decade. The trust had grown, the scholarships expanded, and our philanthropic work had quietly restored the family name in ways Mother's glittering parties never could. Dr. Harrison sat across from me, sipping his coffee. "Your grandfather would be proud," he said simply. I didn't answer right away. Outside, the gardens were in full bloom, tulips and roses swaying gently in the breeze. The same terrace where I'd once landed in a rain of glass now served as a quiet place for morning tea. I thought about Elaine. I hadn't heard from her again since the letter no calls. No visits, no attempts at reconciliation. Perhaps she'd finally accepted that her reign was over. Or perhaps she was simply waiting for the next opening that would never come. Victor's name surfaced once in the news, an inmate altercation. Nothing fatal, but enough to remind me that the world outside these walls still carried its own storms. But here, in this house, there was peace. The scars on my arms had faded to the point where only I noticed them. They were not marks of pain anymore, but of survival proof that I had endured, adapted, and claimed what was mine without losing myself. I stood and walked to the open French doors, the breeze carrying the faint scent of roses. Power, I realized, wasn't in the trust, the company, or even the house. Power was knowing that no one could take away the life I had built, not through manipulation, not through intimidation, and certainly not through fear. And as I stepped out onto the terrace, the sun warming my skin, I knew this was exactly the ending my grandfather had intended for me.